With regard to Joan's wedding during the war, I believe it was November 1940, but there was no grand reception like they have today because of the war limitations with the food rationing, and it happened on a working day in the week, if I remember right. So there was very few guests there, just a few from each side, with Eileen and Sheila were the bridesmaid. But after the tea, which was very plain, I can tell you, and with no wine at all, because of course there was no wine being imported because of it wasn't worthwhile risking men's lives to bring wine in during the war when they might be torpedoed by submarines. But the whole affair was very quiet, and after the meal that we'd had, we just dispersed. There was no celebrations or anything like that afterwards. In fact, my only holiday during the war was one that I spent with Joan, because after Joan's wedding, they moved to a place called Hopwood, and this was in between Birmingham and Redditch, and they'd got an old farmhouse where they were living, and there was plenty of room in it. So I'd got this week off, the only week off I got during the war, I might say. I'd got this week off, and I thought I'd spend it with Joan, because there were the only seaside places open during the war was on the northeast coast. All the east coast and the south coast, anywhere within bombing range, or where there were, particularly because of the south and the east coast, where there was always this danger of invasion. So all the holiday places on those coasts were closed down during the war, and Blackpool and Morecambe and that way onwards was about the only place there was to go for a holiday. And in fact, your mum, she had a holiday by the seaside. She went along with Mrs. Poles, and they went to Blackpool. And I think that was the only holiday that Mum had during the war. But of course she wasn't tied in any way, not to the extent that would stop her from having a week's holiday. While I was at Joan's, I took the opportunity to look up an aunt of mine. I knew that she lived in Birmingham, but I didn't know where, because I hadn't been in touch with her at all. It had been 40 years previously since I'd seen her, and I was only a small child then, and probably about 3 years of age. So I hardly remember anything about that at all. About the only thing I remember was going on a train, and it was the first time I'd been on a train. But apart from that, I don't remember anything about it. But I'd got an idea that if I went to the Birmingham Library and looked up the electoral lists, I might be able to trace her. And so I did that. I went, and fortunately I did find the name in the electoral register, and I went to see her and spent the afternoon and evening with them. And And I met cousins who I'd never seen at all in my life before. Some of them were nearly as old as myself, and yet I'd never seen them before. It was quite an experience. There was another thing about what happened during the war, was that I had false teeth, and also for the first time I had to wear spectacles, because during the war the roofs of factories, especially where the roofs were glass, were all blacked out, and it meant that they had to have the electric light on all the time. And with me spending such long hours at work, and my work itself was a strain on the eyesight, I began to find out that the strain must have caused some loss of eyesight, because I began to find out that I had difficulty in doing my close work. It was merely, of course, I didn't need them for reading ordinarily. I didn't need them for knocking about. It was just that I needed them at work, because I had to work to close limits, and with failing eyesight I couldn't do that without spectacles. But the war ended at last, and my word, weren't we all pleased. The first thing that happened was, of course, that all the blackout was done away with, and it's quite a marvellous thing after the war was finished and all the lights could come on again. We got so used to knocking about in the blackout that when lights did come on, it seemed like the Blackpool illuminations. I think it was in 1946 that Eileen got married. And of course, although there were still shortages of a lot of things, we were able to give her a better wedding than what we'd been able to give Joan. In fact, the reception was held at Anne's Cafe on Chilwell High Road, and we was able to get plenty of food, but there was still this shortage of wine. And I remember I went all round Nottingham to try and get some bottles of wine. I finished up with 4, but they weren't a very good vantage, I'm afraid. But the wedding itself was held on Chilwell Road Methodist Church, and Jean Poles, a friend of a daughter of this Mrs. Poles, who your mum was very friendly with, she was quite a good singer, this Jean Poles. She was about the same age as Eileen, and Eileen knew her very well, and she'd arranged with her to sing at the wedding service, and it was very nice. We quite enjoyed listening to her singing. But another thing was that for the first time, some of my family were able to attend. There was only 2, as a matter of fact. My sister Hilda and my sister Alice managed to attend, but of course nobody had been able to attend when Joan was married during the war, because there was all kinds of difficulties in travelling. In fact, there was notices up in the railway stations which said, "Is your journey really necessary?" The government itself, of course, were trying to cut down as much travelling as necessary, especially unnecessary travelling. Even after the war was over, I was still busy at work. I still had to work overtime at night and Saturday mornings, because what was happening, of course, was that during the war, the Raleigh had gradually changed over from making cycles to making war material, war equipment. And in fact, they made about 10% of the usual number of cycles, and some of those were for war purposes. For instance, we made a folding bicycle for the use of airborne troops, so that they could put them on the back, and when they landed, just get on the bicycles. But of course, that was one of the things. But of course, we made all sorts of war material. And now the demand now, of course, was for normal goods, for bicycles, and because the production of bicycles have been cut down almost completely during the war, there was a huge demand, and of course we had to turn back again in the tool room from making tools for war materials to making tools again for bicycles, because the tools that we'd made before the war that made bicycles had gradually got run down during the war, and we hadn't bothered to replace them. And now they all wanted replacing or repairing, and we was in the tool rooms. We were as busy as ever. But and of course, all this meant that I'd got a pocket full of money, because during the war there was a kind of it was almost a compulsory form of savings. What happened was that the tax that you paid was increased by about 20. Well, it was increased by more than 25%, but it was on the understanding that after the war was over and the country got on its feet again, you'd get that 25% of the tax you'd paid returned to you. So it was really a compulsory form of saving and helping finding money for the government to run the war at the same time. So, of course, when the war was over and this extra tax was dropped, and working overtime, and during the war, in spite of making a lot of money due to overtime and whatnot, we hadn't been able to spend it because the goods weren't there to spend it on. For instance, on the occasions when I did have a weekend off, Mum and I used to go down into Nottingham, and I'd have a pocket full of money that I hadn't spent, and we'd go down with the intention of having a nice time in Nottingham, but we usually came back and we hadn't been able to spend it. We'd perhaps been able to go into a cinema or perhaps the theatre or something. It was usually the theatre for a change, but that was about the only thing we could spend the money on, and you came back with a pocket full of money. But that was the situation after the war was over, and in the tool room, for instance, at the Raleigh, we seemed to be constantly busy, and there wasn't enough skilled men to do all the skilled work that was required. And for years after, we carried on working overtime. And at the finish, although for one thing had happened just after the war was this, that the unions, of course, were in a very strong position now because of this huge demand for goods, and they were able to get the working hours reduced. Even after the First World War, the working hours had been reduced from 54 to 47. Now we were asking for a reduction from 47 to 40. And although we didn't get it all at once, I think what they did do, they kept dropping it about 2 hours at a time over a couple of years, but eventually we got the 40-hour week. and we benefited in a lot of other ways. The Raleigh were generous in quite a lot of respects, as a matter of fact, and because of they were doing so well after the war, in addition to our wages, when the annual meeting of the company was held at the end of the year, and the interest on for the shareholders was declared, there was a certain amount of the profits were put to one side for distribution amongst the men. So kind of a yearly bonus out of the profits, and we began to get this as well, and it lasted for quite a number of years until the demand started to drop, and then they weren't making as much profit, and they knocked the bonus to the workmen off. Another thing was that we could now start going on the annual holidays again to the seaside. And it was then that we'd never fancied going to Skegness for a week, because although previous to the war we'd gone on day trips, and in fact we'd gone quite often on these day trips, which were quite cheap. But we never stayed a week at Skegness, but now we tried Skegness for a change, and we began to like it. Although Mum had another week at Blackpool after the war ended, and now that I come to remember, I joined her there, but it was a rather queer experience, because when she'd booked in at this boarding house in Blackpool, she, along with Mrs. Poles again, of course the war hadn't ended, and when it came that the war ended and I'd got my holiday coming at in the August, of course I tried to book in at the same digs, but I found out that they were full, and so I had to look through the posts, through the adverts, and I found another place, another boarding house that I wrote to, and I got in at this boarding house, and but after one night in this boarding house, I'd had enough of it. I began to get bitten by fleas in the bed, and between one thing and another, at the end of the first night, I'd had enough of that place, so I went and told the landlady I was leaving, and I did do. And I went out on Blackpool front, and my idea was to meet Mum and have a talk to her, see if there was any possibility of getting in somewhere near to where she was. And I thought perhaps if there'd been any vacancies in the one that she was in, perhaps somebody had cried off and it had left a vacancy, I might after all be able to get in along with her. But we happened to meet, as I was walking along the front, I happened to meet Mum, and I told her what the situation was, and I let her, I'd got me suitcase with my clothes and things on, so I agreed to leave these. She was with Mrs. Poles, by the way, and they sat down on a seat on the front and looked after my suitcase while I went looking for somewhere to get in. And what I did, I just kept walking up and down the streets looking for a vacancy card in the window, and at last I found one. It wasn't a great way from where your mum was, as a matter of fact, but anyway, I got in there, and I was happy enough, apart from the fact that that I had to leave your mum at night and go back to my digs, but apart from that, we had a nice holiday, although there was still quite a lot of shortages then. But we liked Blackpool that much. Well, it was after all the years of hardships and lack of something, like to take the heaviness out of life. To go to Blackpool and have a week's enjoyment there, it was really great. And I'd never been fond of Blackpool before because I thought it was too crowded and noisy. But I enjoyed this all right, so that we went the following summer. And in fact, and Mr. Powles also came the following summer, so that the two families went to Blackpool together the following summer, and we knocked about together. It was there the following summer where you could have joyrides in there, you could have flights in an aeroplane. There was an airfield just outside Blackpool, and for 10 shillings they'd take you up for about half an hour. Well, I couldn't get your mum to come up. I couldn't get Mum to come up along with me, and Sheila was with us, and she wouldn't allow me to take Sheila up with me. So, but we had Barbara Bostock. That was one of Sheila's friends at the time. We had this Barbara Bostock, and of course Jean Powles was there too, with her parents. So I took Jean Powles and Barbara Bostock up in this aeroplane, and we had a trip over Blackpool, right over Blackpool Tower and a bit over the sea. And of course they'd never been in an aeroplane before, and it was quite an experience for them. And I know Sheila was very disappointed because Mum wouldn't let her come with me. The war had meant that we had experienced a shortage of certain foods, such as eggs and even green vegetables. So after the war was over, the first opportunity I got, I used it to obtain the tenancy of an allotment that was just behind my garden. The tenant who had it previously was emigrating to America. So when I found out that this man was emigrating to America, I realised that a shed and some fowl and tools and other different kinds of things, coal frames and things like that he'd got on the allotment, I realised that he would want to sell them naturally before leaving the country. So I applied for the tenancy of this allotment, and when I was granted it, I bought the fowls and the shed and all the odds and ends that went with it from this man. And so for quite a number of years I was able to both keep fowl and that meant having new laid eggs, and also we could have a fowl for dinner every now and again. But the main thing was too, we also had an abundance of fresh vegetables all the time. And I carried this on for quite a number of years until the time came when I was told by the council that I wasn't allowed to keep fowl on the allotment, so I had to sell those. But I kept on with the allotment. I kept on with the allotment for about the next 15 years until the digging and the dampness from the soil and one thing or another began to affect me, and I had to give it up. But I kept on with my own back garden and did as much as I could in that. It seems from now on that things were running fairly smoothly, with little out of the ordinary happening. One important thing, however, was that my mother died, which was a great loss, as she had been a good mother. And then the next thing of importance that happened after that I can remember at the moment was that my youngest daughter was married in 1951. Now, while we're on the subject of weddings, I made a mistake in the early part of my histoire. I stated that Joan, my oldest daughter, had been married in 1920, and my second daughter was married in 1926. As a matter of fact, Joan was married in 1922, and Eileen was married in, no, not 1922, there I go again making mistakes. Joan was married in 1942, and Eileen was married in 1944, and Sheila was married in 1951. I think I've got them right that time. Sheila was married in the Boundary Road Congregational Church, and it was the first time we'd really been able to have a good reception, because there was now plenty of food about. In fact, there was plenty of most things, so we didn't have all the shortages that we'd had to put up with when Joan and Eileen were married. And so, naturally, well, we were, in some respects, able to have a better time. One result of this, of course, was that all three girls left home. Joan was still at Hopwood, where she'd been before she was married, and she'd now got a little girl, so we got a granddaughter. And Eileen had moved to Chilwell. She was in some temporary buildings, wooden houses that had been built temporarily until there was more brick buildings built. And Sheila had gone into rooms in Sherwood, and that is just a part of Nottingham. So Mum and I were on our own. And although it wasn't very nice looking at the empty bedrooms and remembering the three girls who had slept in them, there was one thing about it, that it was less work for Mum, and she wasn't getting any younger, and she rather welcomed the easier time. In the summer of 1952, Mum and I, now that we were on our own, got to going out quite a lot at weekends, almost regularly, you could say. On Saturday, we would sometimes go into Nottingham and have a walk round the shops, perhaps do a little bit of shopping, but the main thing was just to have a look round for a change. And sometimes we'd go and sit in the Arboretum, or sometimes we'd even go as far as Trent Bridge and sit by the river there. And but then also on a Sunday, during the summer particularly, we got to going out on a Sunday night just for a walk. We would walk up Woollerton Vale and as far as Woollerton Village, and come. We'd perhaps sit in, I think, the Admiral Rodney, I think that was the name of the pub there, and just have a glass of beer and then sit down and look round at the people passing, because there was quite a lot of people were doing this particular thing at the time. And perhaps another, after we'd had this little rest and a drink, we'd just walk easily back home. And we just enjoyed going out for the nice quiet walk. Sometimes we would go Bramcote way instead. And we continued this for most of the summer. In May of 1952, Sheila came and stayed with us for a week, and then a week later, Mum went to stay with Joan. And of course I couldn't go for a week with her because I'd got to go to work, of course. And then at the end of that week, a niece of mine at the Old, Mona Finney, her name was, she was getting married. And we'd both had an invitation to the wedding, but of course with your mum going to Joan's, we couldn't go, she couldn't go to the wedding, but so I decided to go on my own. And as we got 2 days, the Saturday and the Sunday, I went up on the Saturday. The wedding was on the Saturday, and in the meantime, I'd written a letter to Mum, and I'd told her that instead of going straight back from the Holt to Beeston, I would go to Liverpool and get the train there at Lime Street Station, and I would go down to Shrewsbury, and I would meet her on Shrewsbury Station, and then we'd get another train from there back to Beeston. And we did this. I went to the wedding, and I enjoyed a nice day particularly with my brothers and sisters and different relatives, in addition to just attending the wedding, because of course you always meet a lot of your relatives at weddings, and this was no different from any other. And I carried out the plan that we'd decided on. And on the Sunday, I got the train from Lime Street, went to Shrewsbury, picked your mum up, and came back home. And so we had it was really a nice outing for both of us. And there wasn't much different then. We just came back, and I went back to work, and it was just the same old round. And then we decided to have our holiday at Skegness that year, and we booked for a fortnight, as a matter of fact, at a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Neslan, the name of the boarding house was Warwick Hotel. And unfortunately, after we got to Skegness, we got there on the Saturday, and on the Sunday it started to rain, and it was raining for about 3 days. In fact, on the Sunday it was raining continuously. There was nowhere to go that we knew of, and so we decided to get on the bus and just go as far as Boston on the bus, and then get out at Boston and just walk along the street for a bit and then come back. It was just a matter of passing the evening away. And of course we did this. And by Wednesday, fortunately, the weather had cleared up and the sun came out, and we were going along the prom, and then we went on the pier, and while we were looking in some of these amusements that they have at the side of the pier, suddenly Mum realised that somebody had stole a purse out of her handbag. So that was rather unfortunate because all the money was in it. Of course, luckily, I'd got enough money with me, so it didn't really bother us in that sense. But of course, it wasn't nice having your money stolen. But anyway, we thought it's no use crying over spilled milk, so we just forgot the whole idea and set out to get some enjoyment out of our holiday. And of course, the fact that it kept fine and warm for the rest of the fortnight, well, it made it that at any rate we enjoyed the latter part of our holiday very much. Later on in August, Sheila and Frank were going to spend a week at my sister Mary's, Sheila's Auntie Mary, of course, at Whitsands. Although my sister Mary lived in Plymouth, they had a wooden bungalow on the top of the cliffs at Whitsands, and down at the bottom of the cliffs there was a lovely stretch of sand. And of course, my sister's husband was named Jim Parr, and Jim Parr and my sister, they would go for weekends at this bungalow, but sometimes they would let it out because they didn't always want to go. And I'd written to my sister and asked her if she'd let it out for a week to Sheila and her husband, and they'd agreed. So Sheila and Frank were going on they should have gone on the Saturday, but I think Frank worked at that particular time. I think he was always working Saturdays, so they had to leave it Sundays. And Frank stopped overnight, and Sheila, the two of them stopped overnight with us until Sunday morning, when they got the train and went off to Plymouth on their holiday. I think I've mentioned previously about John, my middle daughter's husband. That's Eileen's husband. I think I remembered I've remarked previously about him having pneumonia and being in hospital. Well, evidently it had left some weakness behind, because in October of this year he had another attack of pneumonia and had to go into hospital with it. That was at the beginning of October. Now, Mum wasn't keeping very well at that time. She'd two troubles. One was, the worst one was her ear. She was having a lot of trouble with her ear. It was very painful, and it wasn't very nice to bear, having this pain in her ear all the time, and it used to upset her. But apart from that, she also seemed to be having some internal trouble, and she felt she wanted a break. So she agreed with her sister Elsie to have her for a week. And so she wrote to her sister Elsie and agreed to go. And of course her sister Elsie at that time was the housekeeper for Mr. Turton. But Mr. Turton didn't object to Mum going and staying there. So Mum went for a week with her sister Elsie. Actually, I can't remember now just how long Mum stayed at Sister Elsie's, but I think she might have stayed even longer for a week. I think she stayed at least a fortnight, but as I say, I'm not quite sure now. But while she was away, Joan came to visit Eileen, evidently because John was in hospital, and Joan came over probably to see if she could help in any way with Eileen. And she brought her daughter Jill with her. Of course, although I've not mentioned it earlier, Joan by now had 3 children. It's only natural, of course. That's the sort of thing that starts to occur when they got married. But the second was a boy named David, and the third one was this little girl Jill. And she brought Jill with her, of course, left the 2 oldest behind with her husband. And I had them all round for tea with me one day, and then I also had another thing I forgot to mention was, as I'm mentioning about the grandchildren appearing on the scene now, Eileen also had a baby. His name was Graham. He was a boy. Well, I had Graham and Jill for tea while Joan and Eileen visited John in hospital. And I don't think there was, apart from the fact that, of course, Joan went back after a few days, and then in time John began to recover and he came out of hospital, and in the meantime Mum had come back. So, and all this happened in the month of October, and I don't seem to be able to remember much in that particular year. In fact, I don't seem to remember much about the next year either. There was one thing in 1954, in January even. I went with Mum to the Nottingham Co-op in Parliament Street, and of course things were going pretty well financially. I was still in regular work and earning good money, and I decided, we were looking round and we saw some mink marmot coats, a kind of a fur coat, and your Mum was admiring one, and well, she was looking at the lot and admiring them, and so I said, I decided to buy her one there and then, and I actually did. Of course, Mum was very proud of herself wearing a mink coat, and she really looked nice in it too. And actually, the coat's still in existence. I know, I'm not sure which of my daughters have it at this moment. I don't know whether it's Joan or Sheila. It could be either of those two. But I'm sure I can't. I could find out by asking them, but as neither of them are here at this moment, and I'm not likely to see them for a day or two, we'll just have to leave it at that. The next thing we had, my sister Alice and her husband and family, of course, she had 2 boys. They lived at Derby, and we went to, we paid them a visit and had a look round Derby at the same time. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, we'd started this business of going out on a Saturday, and I mentioned about having looked round Nottingham, but we began to widen the distance that we went, and instead of just going to Nottingham, we liked a variety like anybody else, and we went to all the towns around in turn. For instance, we go one Saturday to Mansfield, another Saturday perhaps to Lincoln, another to Leicester, another to Derby, and we even went as far afield as Sheffield on one occasion, but on that occasion Frank took us in the car. But we did get around to all the different places on Saturday, and it was really nice seeing all these different towns, spending a whole day just going round, and we'd have a dinner, and usually we used to look for the cooperative main building, because usually there was a restaurant there, and after we'd walked round a bit, we'd make our way to the co-op restaurant and have a dinner, and then sit down. Of course, it was rest as well, and after we'd had a dinner, we'd go looking around in the afternoon.